started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's our second day for our Western Slope Livestock and Forage Grower Update. Hopefully everybody can see the intro slides okay. Today will be the last day we'll have this for this year. So we'll begin here and then end at about 1 p.m. We've got 3 speakers that Sydney's going to introduce for us as we get started. So if my computer will work, there we go. All right, so this is an educational webinar brought to you by CSU Extension. Most of us are from the Western Slope. Video conferencing etiquette for today. Internet connections can be good or bad. So if you have a bad connection, remember that the presentation will be recorded for later viewing. And make sure you go ahead and silence your microphones. And if you want, you can turn off your video, but you don't have to. The webinar platform used today disables your camera and audio. There are simply too many people on today to have a live discussion, but your questions are important. So please put them in the chat and we will do our best to answer them as we go. You're in a class and also at home or other locations. So please keep from being distracted while taking this class so we don't need to repeat ourselves, as that leaves less time to answer the questions. If you are somewhere other than the West Slope, welcome, but understand that most of our examples in today's presentations are more geared for the Western Slope. So if you have any questions, please contact your local extension office. If you need closed captioning for today's presentation, please email Retta at rettabrugger@colostate.edu, and she has put her email in the chat. And CSU is an equal access and equal opportunity university. Colorado State's University Office of Engagement and Extension ensures that no person is subjected or prohibited discrimination based on national origin or in any program or service. It is our policy to ensure that reasonable steps are taken to provide timely, meaningful access and an equal opportunity to participants in services, activities, programs, and other benefits to individuals whose first language is not English. This policy includes providing oral interpretation or written translation of vital documents and other information to limited English proficient persons without a cost to those participants. So if you need a Spanish translation, again, please reach out to Retta. And I'll just briefly go through and introduce the Western Slope agents here. So we've got Retta Brugger. She's the range management, CSU Extension in Grand County, or in Grand Junction, I'm sorry. And then we've got Emily Lockhart. She's the CSU Extension in Montezuma County. She's the director. Gus Westerman, CSU Extension Dolores County Director. Hannah Kirsting, CSU Extension Gunnison County Director. Jenny Byerman, Ag Economist, CSU Extension in Grand Junction. Myself, Megan Stetson, and I'm located in Moffat County. Robin Young, CSU Extension in Archuleta County. Sydney Pryor, Jackson County, and Todd Hagenbuch out of Routt County. And should we have problems in the event of technical difficulties or unplanned issues on this webinar, look to your email for a link for a new webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started in another webinar. So be on the lookout for that if things go awry. And that is all I have, so I will pass it over to Sydney.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. For our first speaker today, we have Dr. Raye Walck. Since graduating from CSU in 1998, Dr. Walck has practiced veterinary medicine in a variety of settings, including mixed practice, avian influenza emergency response with the USDA, and in her current capacity as the director of CSU Western Slope Veterinary Diagnostic Lab Director. Therefore, Dr. Walck, when you get a chance, can you please unmute yourself and put your presentation up? Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Hello, everyone. Thanks for meeting with me today. As Sydney said, I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about current events in Colorado livestock. And this is from a veterinary standpoint. I am a veterinarian, and I currently am the director of the Western Slope Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. So my bend is going to be from a diagnostic standpoint. And we're going to talk about some diseases today that are important and that are ongoing in Colorado. That's me. Oops.
You can use the keyboard now, probably.
Okay, so kind of current livestock disease statuses. Today we're gonna talk about Trichomonas fetus or trick in cattle, and we're gonna talk about equine infectious anemia or Coggins in horses, Brucella ovis in sheep, and high path avian influenza in poultry. All of those we do have in Colorado or have had in 2023, and I think they're really important to talk about. The first we're going to talk about is equine infectious anemia, and you may or may not recognize this as the Coggins test that we perform in lab. Now, equine infectious anemia is a viral disease that affects horses and donkeys, ponies, zebras. There is no vaccination and there's no treatment. So infection in horses is oftentimes inapparent and can result in a long-term carrier state, and those horses will become a reservoir for the virus to be passed to other horses. The way that it is passed is through biting insects. So you have a horse, it has equine infectious anemia, the virus, it gets bitten by a blood-feeding fly, and that fly pops on over to another horse and spreads the virus. The horse can get very, very sick initially in its infection. If it survives, it'll become that carrier. This is a disease that's found all over the world. It is found in the United States. It is not a threat to people, and it is a reportable disease. The important part about equine infectious anemia and why it's so important is because horses that are infected, positive horses, if we determine that they're infected, they need to be quarantined for life. And if you have horses, you know how difficult that would be, or they're euthanized. So this is a death sentence for horses, and it's very, very important that we limit exposure. So this is a map that was provided by the USDA in 2022. These are the equine infectious anemia cases. Now, in 2022, we had 40 cases in California. We had 16 in North Carolina, 7 in South Carolina, 14 in Texas, 2 in Washington, but we also had singular cases in Colorado, Georgia, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. So this is present. I think that a lot of horse owners and a lot of veterinarians kind of maybe dismissed it as, you know, being that significant. Oh, it's probably not EIA, it's not really a big deal. There are people that were kind of not wanting to test for it. And it's something it's suggested to be tested for annually, and it's required in Colorado for horses that are leaving the state for interstate transportation. And most states have a requirement that a horse have a negative Coggins test before entering. Now, Coggins test, the results of a Coggins test and the accession number associated with that test when the laboratory tests it is written on a certificate of veterinary inspection. That's the health certificate. So horses need to have a negative Coggins test referenced by that number on a health certificate to be transported to other states. That's the Colorado law. In 2022, the United States performed 1,349,759 tests. There were 96 positive horses identified in the United States. In Colorado, that was 25,000 tests performed in one horse that was positive. In 2023, we did identify a positive horse here on the Western Slope. And unfortunately, those horses were euthanized. So it is possible for it to happen here. Like I said before, EIA is transmitted by biting flies, but another mode of transmission, I think that is often forgotten, is that it can be transmitted through contaminated equipment. So that could be needles, syringes, if people reuse needles and syringes for vaccination or blood draws. Sometimes for some reasons, horses will be given intravenous medication or IV fluids or have blood transfusions. And if those are contaminated or if they're used on multiple horses, that's a really great way to spread that virus. So prevention for EIA is one, annual testing or surveillance so we can identify any horses that are positive, and two, reducing the exposure to biting flies and not reusing that type of equipment that can spread it. The next disease I want to talk about is Trichomonas fetus, and this is a sexually transmitted disease of cattle. It is a reproductive disease that is a protozoan parasite, and that parasite lives in the prepuce or the sheath of bulls and is transmitted during mating. It causes early fetal loss. It can cause early abortion, but the most common thing seen with trich is a delayed calving interval or late bred cows at preg checking. So if a bull infects a cow, the cow can clear the infection within a few months and then recycle and be able to breed on the next cycle after it's cleared. But that immunity is short-lived. She can get reinfected. And if she does get pregnant, she could abort, or she's clearly going to calve later. Most bulls don't show any signs, but they can shed that organism forever. In Colorado, testing of bulls is required prior to sale, import, export, or turn out onto public lands or in grazing pools, so your bulls don't infect your neighbor's bulls. Testing for trich is done by an accredited veterinarian. They collect a sample. They do a scraping of the inside of the sheath of the bull, and they submit it to one of 3 labs in Colorado. There are 3 approved labs that test it in Colorado, and we look for specifically the RNA in that protozoan parasite. And once again, trich is oftentimes not really thought about, or people think, oh, it's not a big deal. It costs money to have my bulls tested. I mean, it raises my cost per bull. We don't really have it that much, but we do have cases in Colorado. In 2023, we had 6 cases, and on this map, I've marked the counties in which we have positive trich cases. How do bulls get it? Well, once again, it's a sexually transmitted infection, but they can, bulls jump fences. They don't really care about fences, especially when there's cows on the other side. So an infected bull could hop a fence, break through a fence, and infect the neighbor's cows. Cows that commingle, same thing. If you introduce a bull that has not been tested or that is positive, you've just exposed your cows. The other thing is, when we have those late bred cows and a delayed calving interval, keeping those cows another season could potentially be risky if you don't know that you don't have trich. They could be late bred or open because of trich. You don't want to infect your herd the next following year. The foundation for building a prevention program against trich is testing the bulls, testing all bulls that'll have exposure. So new bulls that come into the herd should be tested before exposed to cows. one of the ways that, again, I think one of the management strategies that we can use to help keep trick out of our herds is definitely to preg check your cows. Culling any late bred or open cows, testing any bull that could be exposed to the cows. And we recommend testing yearly. And then we also, the use of virgin bulls is obviously a really great management strategy. The next disease I'd like to talk about just briefly is Brucella ovis in sheep. It is also a sexually transmitted reproductive disease in sheep. It's a bacteria. It's a brucellosis of sheep, but it does not infect humans. It is transmitted from ram to ewe and also ram to ram during non-breeding seasons when they're often housed together. It causes infertility in those rams, and it can cause early fetal loss, abortion, again, a lengthened breeding season, and most significantly, reduced lamb crop and increased ram to ewe ratio. So the cost of producing these lambs is going to go way up if you have brucellosis in your herd. There's no vaccine for it. It is, once again, it's not zoonotic. And one of my, this is a pretty cool picture of two ram testicles. The testicle on the top, that big ball on the right side, pardon my pun, is the epididymis, and that is why we call this ram epididymitis. And the bottom testicle is the epididymis is normal. To prevent Brucella ovis, once again, you buy negative rams. You make sure that your rams are tested before they come into your herd. You quarantine new rams until they are tested negative. And you want to encourage your neighbors, anybody that you're grazing next to test and cull as well. Performing ram breeding soundness exams, not just rams, but when we're talking about cattle as well, performing breeding soundness exams is very, very important because a lot of times you can identify abnormalities in the testicles just by palpating them or examining the semen under the microscope. It's a really great time to draw blood and perform that Brucella ovis test. This is a disease. Trick and Brucella ovis are regulated by the Colorado Department of Agriculture and the state veterinarian. All breeding rams 6 months of age or older must be tested within 30 days of the sale. They do have to have an official identification tag on them. Positive rams, if they're identified, they're sent straight to slaughter. Remaining exposed rams need to be quarantined and retested between 45 and 120 days after the first test. In Colorado, now our laboratory here on the Western Slope tests a lot of samples of Brucella ovis. We test anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 samples a year from all over the country. There are currently 2 quarantine flocks in Colorado that have Brucella ovis. One of them is hopefully will be cleared soon, but we see a lot of Brucella ovis positive rams in our lab. I know that one of the hottest topics in Colorado is highly pathogenic avian influenza. I'm going to go through this briefly because I think there's been a lot of information out there on it. The Colorado Department of Agriculture has on their website, they have a tremendous amount of very good information on high path. This is a severe, very severe and highly transmissible disease of birds. Now, the normal reservoir of this flu is our shorebirds and waterfowl. Usually doesn't cause as severe infection in those types of birds, but when it gets into poultry, it can really, really, really wipe them out in a devastating way. It's transmitted from a fecal-oral route. It can be aerosolized. You can transmit it on your clothes, on your hands. Other animals, rodents, wildlife can bring that in to a poultry situation and cause an outbreak. It has an extremely high morbidity, so lots and lots of birds get sick. Most of them get sick and most of them will die after they get it. And it's an awful way to die. They get the flu and they die from severe respiratory disease. In the outbreak in Colorado, we do currently have high path in Colorado. We had a terrible outbreak in 2022, and the economic losses across the country, because it was all over the country, was in the billions. And as of 2022, I think my latest number was Colorado's euthanized 6.7 million birds, being poultry, with this outbreak. The most important, I'm going to go through this slide, I'll just maybe skip over it a little bit, but the most important way to kind of stop high path and prevent high path is through biosecurity. And when I say biosecurity, this is a dedicated plan that's designed in order to keep those germs out, keep the virus out, and if you get it, to identify it rapidly, report it, and then we need to eliminate the virus. Unfortunately, right now that means euthanasia in order to stop the spread. So in Colorado, as of 2 days ago, there were 11 commercial premises that were high path positive. There is one current positive premises on the Western Slope in Delta County. In 2022, we lost over 90% of Colorado egg layers. And you can imagine the devastating economic loss associated with this virus. So I just pulled this off the Colorado Department of Agriculture's website. This is a county map 22 to 23 that shows high path avian influenza positive cases. Some of them are wild birds and some of them are in mammals. We have seen it in some mammals and poultry here. So like I said, prevention equals biosecurity. So preventing environmental exposure, keeping birds inside, unfortunately, is the way to keep them not exposed to wild birds or wildlife. Keeping visitors to a minimum, definitely making sure that you are cleaning any tools, shoes, boots, anything, and don't share equipment between, one bird pen to another or one bird premises to another. And that's really important for our small flock owners. You don't want to go play with your chickens and then go play with somebody else's chickens and then somebody else's chickens. So that can be a very efficient way to transmit the virus. Reporting sick birds and reporting bird die-offs is extremely important. That needs to be reported to the state veterinarian. If in a poultry operation, if you're having increased death losses, that definitely warrants a call to either your field state veterinarian or the state veterinarian's office. Kind of in summary, surveillance and testing is a very important part of preventing disease in livestock and poultry, whether that be for trick, EIA, Brucella ovis, or high path. It's very important to partner with your veterinarians to develop testing and management strategies. Just because many of these diseases are life-threatening and or economically devastating to producers and international markets. If we get high path avian influenza in certain areas, not if we get it, but it definitely impacts international commerce, and other countries will not accept our products if we get things like avian influenza. Also in Colorado, testing for trick, B. ovis, and EIA is required for transit, export, and sale of animals. And I can say any questions. I know I'm getting close to time. I would love to answer any questions if you have them. And I'll just tell you right now, I'm a proud mama of a state champion 140-pound wrestler this year.
Awesome. Congrats. And thank you, Raye. We do have one question in the chat. Can cows be tested for trick? She's guessing that the answer to this is no, but wants to confirm.
Actually, cows can be tested for trick. The sample that we can collect from cows is vaginal fluid or uterine fluid. However, so if if they have the organism and they're shedding the organism, we might be able to catch it in those fluids. But sometimes cows will clear the infection and you won't know it, and we might not catch it.
Thank you.
Question.
And I think that was all the questions we had through the chat.
If anyone wants to contact me individually, my email address and our lab phone number is on the bottom of this slide. I welcome questions or just to visit.
Oh, and we had one more pop through here. Do you think the feral population is why we can't get rid of EIA, and what can we do about it?
I think that I would not blame the feral horse population, horse and donkey population. I think that they certainly can be carriers and contribute to the spread. I think that probably one of the most significant methods of transmission of this virus is reusing equipment. So reusing needles, reusing IVs, and contaminated blood products and equipment. Think of anything that gets horse blood on it and not cleaning it off before it goes into another horse. But there are some places, some people that will do IVs on their own and will do blood transfusions on their own for a number of reasons, and they might not use clean equipment.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Raye, so much. We really appreciate it. And yes, congratulations on your champion wrestler. Retta has kindly put her contact information in the chat. So if anybody has further questions, please reach out to her. Moving on to our next speaker, we have Todd, who is our CSU Routt County Extension Specialist. Todd is the Ag and Natural Resources Extension Specialist for Colorado State University in Routt County, the fourth generation of his family to ranch in Routt County. He began his career in extension in 2012. He handles all manner of agricultural issues, including small acreage management, weed identification and control, rangeland management, and more. When not working on extension programs, he enjoys time with his wife and 2 kids tending to their large garden and small chicken flock. Today, Todd will be presenting about emergency preparedness, fire, flood, and insurance. So Todd, when you get a chance, please unmute yourself and share your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. And I want to make sure we're looking at the right slide here. We're getting the slideshow started. Are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Sydney. Okay, excellent. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us again this morning. Today, we're talking about disasters in agriculture. So how your farm or ranch is impacted by a disaster. And when I say disaster, I don't mean that the gearbox went out on the baler when you've got 50 acres down and it's just at the right moisture. I'm talking about natural disasters and things that come from the outside to impact what's happening at your farm or ranch. So the first question I would ask you is, are you and your property ready for a disaster? And the thing we need to all realize is that ranching and farming is really complicated. We've always got 100 things going on at one time. When you add a natural disaster to the mix, that really can throw things into a tailspin. And so making sure that you're prepared is absolutely a job that you need to think about because it isn't just your home, it's your business. And you are, as the owner of this farm or ranch, the CEO. And as the CEO, you've got that responsibility of making sure that your business has been taken care of in the event the unthinkable happens. Now is the time to plan. And I say now, I really mean right now, not just because we're having this presentation in February, but February is a great time to do this because you're not calving yet, or at least most of you aren't. You might be lambing, but things are going to get really busy in the next couple months. And then once summer comes, who's got time to plan? Because you are in the thick of things, and just making sure that the water's getting turned on, the fences are getting fixed, and that the hay is getting put up. Snow covers a lot of work, my grandfather used to say. And when that snow is gone, there's a lot of work to be done. So how can you take advantage of this time right now and make some plans and think through disaster planning? Note that when I'm talking about disasters, I'm primarily talking about flood and fire, but there are other disasters that we can be talking about as well. So if you are not prepared, what are you going to do about it? And my hope is that after this, you'll start planning. And we're going to talk about some of the things that I'd like for you to think through as you start making that plan. So as you're making that plan, the first thing to question is, what services are available to help me? We'll be talking about at the end of the presentation. I'll give you some links to some resources that you can use to help you walk through making that plan for your farm or ranch. But also think about who is available. Maybe your county emergency manager is someone who could help you think through a plan for your farm or ranch. Maybe the local Colorado State Forest Service can come out, look at your place, and help you think about how to create some defensible space for wildlife. And of course, your extension agent is someone who can help you think through this as well. Also think about when you carry out the plan. I've got a plan. It's great. Maybe it's here on the shelf. Maybe it's in my head. Hopefully it's not just in your head, because that's only helpful to you. But if I'm not here, who's going to help carry out that plan? Yes, it seems like we're married to our farm ranch and we never leave, but sometimes you do. Even if it's just to go to town for groceries or for church, a disaster can unfold in that couple hours that you're gone. So if I'm not here, who's going to be responsible? Knowing if my neighbors have planned and how they've planned, does that impact you? If they're going to bring their cattle out through your driveway, you probably ought to have a conversation about that. If your plan requires you coming up and up through their gate and through their back 40 in order to get the cattle out of an area that a wildfire may be impacting, have you talked to them about that? And how about if your neighbors are gone? How does that impact what your responsibilities are? If you have to get through their cattle, if you have to get through their place, if you're going to be gone and you expect them to help you out, is the inverse true as well? So having that conversation with your neighbors is exceptionally important because disasters don't know property lines. They're going to cross yours and they're going to cross your neighbors as well. So making sure that you're planning together is really important. So what other things should you think about when making a plan? So I said you're the CEO of your business. So thinking about that as a business person, how is it going to impact your business to have things impacted? And what are those worst things that you can think of that would impact you from a business perspective? But also, as we know, your farm or ranch is mostly for most of us on the call today, also our home. So from a personal perspective, how is that disaster going to impact us, especially if it gets to the house? And then we've got not just business and personal perspective, but we've got an ethical question here as well. We're dealing with live animals often. What ethical responsibility do we have to make sure that the cattle, the horses, the barn cats, the dog are taken care of as well? What are some of the environmental issues that we may have around the farm ranch that may impact others? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But so thinking about all these different hats that you wear as a farmer or rancher is so important to think through your plan from the business person's perspective, as a mother, father, son, or daughter, and then also as a stockman. We're going to talk just a little about insurance. The question is, when I say, are you insured enough? I don't just mean, do I have enough insurance on my home? I know that my wife and I found out a little while ago here that we'd had our home insured for the amount it was worth when we purchased it. Well, 15 years later, it's certainly worth more given this market. So we have to adjust our insurance for that. But enough isn't just how many dollars do you have taken out on the tractor, the bull, the house, but do I have enough things insured? And so I'm asking, what do you have insured? Have you really looked at which buildings are insured, which animals are insured, which pieces of machinery are insured? And how about all the tools, the fence post founder, the posts, all these things that we're going to need to get back in business should a flood or fire come through our place, are those things insured? And if they're not, am I going to have enough cash in the bank or a good enough relationship with my banker in order to go to them and say, I need money to get these things back on the ground as soon as possible? How about all that documentation? So you have it insured. Do you have the documentation indicating what's insured in a safe place? And is it on the ranch? And if the ranch is impacted by a disaster, are you going to have access to that? And that's not just about the insurance, but also your depreciation schedules that your tax person is going to be talking about. How about your breed registrations? I put photos in all caps. Photos are really important of all the equipment you've got, all of the tools you've got, so you can go through and make sure that when the fire or flood happens, that you're actually thinking through very systematically, what do we have that's gone now that we're going to need? It's really easy after the disaster comes through to think you're getting everything back together. But if you only use the Bordizio to castrate your calves one time a year, it's probably important that you realize you've lost those earlier in the year than when it comes time that the neighbors are coming for branding. You've got other things to worry about. Knowing that you've replaced all the tools that you've lost is important. Those photos used to be hard copies, of course, could be lost in the disaster. Making sure you have digital photos and having them backed up in the cloud is essential. So have you also considered what you have insured might alter your plan? If you're looking at from a business perspective, what are the things that you can replace? If I have my most expensive tractor insured and I know I can replace that easily because insurance is going to cover the cost of that, maybe that's not the thing I actually save. Maybe that's something that goes in the fire, and the things that aren't insured are the things I grab first. Have you also considered about how are people getting in and out? I've been to some of your places and I know that your driveways are narrow and they have sharp curves. You maybe have gates that are locked. I asked these last two bullet points. If the cavalry is coming in to help save your place, you've put in defensible space around your buildings. They're coming in to get in. Oftentimes we have really tight spaces between the barn and the shop and the house and the garage. If the firefighters look and see that there's a great big place out there to turn around and it turns out to be your leach field and your septic tank and they sink into the ground, not a good thing. So thinking through all of that is really important. And when I think about one way in or one way out, I think of this picture. This is a road in, could be any number of your farms or ranches. That bridge, the fire truck's going across and bridge collapses because it's not used to having that, or it wasn't designed for that heavy weight. So if you can't build the better bridge or a better road, post at the beginning of your driveway limits to length. Fire trucks aren't the same as a truck and a trailer that can pivot in the middle. Can a fire truck get up and down your driveway? And make sure that you haven't put your first responders in a situation that we now have a disaster on top of a disaster. Here's a personal example. And do you have alternative ways in and out? And if the cavalry can't get in, can you get out? What's happening here? Well, the old saying, the Lord willing and the creek don't rise. The creek rose. And this was several years ago, getting my grandmother, who was in her early 90s at the time, out of her house for Mother's Day dinner. You can see that we were walking the plank with her because the bridge was washed out. The culvert's washed out, creek had come up. But not only if there was an emergency for an elderly person who only has one way in and out, the cavalry can't get in to provide her assistance if there was a medical emergency, but we weren't going to get her out either. Think about that in advance, because when the time comes and you're in the middle of a disaster, it's a little difficult to deal with. How about what's going on outside in your outbuildings? We all have a number of outbuildings. So consider, if the fire department's coming in and they've asked me, we can save one of these, which one is it going to be? And how you answer these questions might impact greatly which one you tell the firefighters you'd like to save, or if somebody's coming in to put sandbags down around for a flood. So think about what you have for those buildings. What's the purpose of that building? What is going to be needed for that building after the disaster? Am I going to need that space to calve things out, to store equipment in and keep it safe? How about the historic barn? Is that more important than the pole barn that was just built? Sure, the pole barn's worth more, but it's easily replaceable. I don't know which is going to be most important to you, but also what's in them. If Grandpa's harnesses are in the old barn and that's what's irreplaceable, is that going to, at the moment, influence what you tell the firefighters to protect while you let the shop go up that has all the equipment in it you need to get back in business? But you need to think that through. I can't answer that for you. Only you can answer that for you. How about what's inside them? And does that impact how they burn? Not only what are they made of, but are there things that inside that building? I know any number of us have cans of diesel fuel. We have oil. We have pesticides. If a flood is coming, is it my responsibility to make sure those pesticides, oils are up off the ground? Absolutely it is, because that's going to impact not only my property downstream, but many others. And what are in those buildings that could make a fire burn differently? I've heard stories, of course, of old stores of dynamite being in buildings that ranchers used to use to remove beaver dams, things of that nature. What are in those buildings that you need to let first responders know about, your family know about, your neighbors know about? So again, we don't have a disaster on a disaster. And then also thinking about what is in those buildings I need right now to get back into business. And that's my vet supplies, my fencing supplies, tools, machinery. Thinking through all of that now is absolutely important if you want to be successful getting to the other side of the disaster. This is a beautiful building, but what do you see here that could impact? I see ladder fuels. I see old dry wood. I see hay bales that could easily catch on fire. So some issues potentially when you look at your buildings and your ranch from a different perspective. Not just the buildings that can impact firefighting efforts, and this could relate to flooding as well, but where your hay store piles, and do you have defensible space around your stack yards? Make sure that that if you've got old hay stored in there, that maybe you've got rocks or some other space where a fire, if it was coming, would have a fire break. How about your propane tank? Is that underground? Is it above ground? Can we defend fire around it? And then also keeping in mind that fuel, we all have 300, 500 gallon fuel tanks. Those are not only an issue when a fire comes, but a flood. And so what can I do to mitigate, say, my farm fuel? Here's an example of a little building that somebody's built to keep their fuel tanks in. Note that the roof is made of metal, so if sparks come down, it's helping protect those tanks from catching on fire. We've got a concrete berm that is secondary containment, so if water were to come through, it's not going to wash any leaked oil or fuel downstream, impacting our water source or our neighbors. It also helps provide if a fire is creeping through, as most fires creep through after we've gone. That grass, at least having that concrete there, is going to keep the fire from spreading underneath my 300 to 500 gallon tanks there and causing a bomb to go off. It's not just around the farmstead too, though. Think about your pastures, where you have your cattle. And knowing what time of year, if the disaster comes, and communicating this again with your neighbors or whomever else might be helping you out, family, where are the yearlings? Where are the cows? Are you going to handle them differently in the event of a disaster? How about your water sources? Thinking about flood and fire both. If there's a flood or fire upstream from your ponds, your other water sources, your live water, your ditch, your irrigation ditch, how are you going to make sure that when the disaster comes, you're protecting those sources? And or if you haven't protected those, provided other sources of stock water, because regardless of what's going on in the disaster, your stock is going to need water. And then which fences, is you're watching the disaster unfold, what fences are going to most likely go first, and what's on either side of those fences? Your cows, your neighbor's cows, thinking about how stock is going to mix and how you're going to prevent that and or deal with it in advance is really important, because you're going to be under a lot of stress when the disaster comes. Not a great time to be making that decision. And so how can you mitigate those things in advance too? Not just thinking through them, but are there things you can do to mitigate in advance? Maybe it's an extra gate in another area to make sure that you can get out of the pasture if the fire or flood is in an area. Just thinking that through now is really important. So just remember, overall, mitigation efforts apply to the entire farm and ranch, and not just the buildings, but your pasture, your water sources, your hay storage, and anything else that's important to you as a CEO and business owner of a very complex business. Also, remember that fire can start at the farm or ranch. This is a location out in the Eastern Plains, actually more of a feedlot situation, but the feed grinder started on fire. Bearing went out. It wasn't stopped in time. And this is many thousands, $100,000 worth of feed getting burned up. Note the tires on top. So we got environmental disaster. We're losing feed. And the fire can start there and then spread to your neighbors. And think of the losses that happened there. If you're out welding, innocently enough outside the shop and the grass catches on fire, the fire could start at your place. How are you going to live with yourself if you and or your neighbors' businesses are impacted because you actually started the fire? So don't be the cause of your own and others' disasters. Some things you can do right now, or maybe as soon as the snow melts. But make sure your address is clearly visible at the end of the driveway. So when the cavalry does come, they know exactly how to find you. In remote areas, it's so easy to miss the driveway, and we have small little numbers up. Put some big numbers up. So when you call 911 and give your address, they know exactly where they're going. Have sizable fire extinguishers, not just in the shop near the welder, but outside. Because if something were to happen outside, have them make visible so anybody who gets there can run up to the shop, run up to the barn, grab that fire extinguisher and start to fight the fire. Make sure that hand tools, axes, shovels, other firefighting efforts, or if there water's coming, how we can move water, make sure that's all available for anybody to use, and make sure that you've got good hoses on your hydrants. And number one thing you can do, sign up for Reverse 911. Nearly every county on the West Slope offers that. Look at your county's website, look up Reverse 911 and sign up for it so you can be in the know if and when a disaster comes. Also know that you do have resources. Colorado State University, we have a great website here. This will all be linked on the ABM website. We'll give you that link in the chat, but we can help you with our resources at Colorado State University Extension. Also, that Penn State has this fantastic Ready Ag disaster workbook that you can walk through. Also know that this Ready, Set, Go wildfire preparedness is specifically for wildfire, not flood, but some of the same thoughts and thought processes and going through this checklist can help you with flood as well. Go there and just simply walk through this process pretty quick, and you too can have a plan on how you're going to prepare your farm or ranch for a disaster. With that, we'll see if there's any questions in the chat. And thanks.
Thanks, Todd. At the moment, we don't have any questions. If anybody's got anything for Todd, pop that in the chat.
I've scared them all to death, Megan.
We do have some thank yous. Todd, I have a question for you. If someone, some county extension offices work with their local emergency management teams to have CART volunteers, so community animal response teams. If individuals want to participate in those or get involved, how do they go about that?
Oh, great question, Megan. First thing I do, if you believe that you are well equipped to help in the event of a fire or flood or any other natural disaster, and you want to get on your county's response team, contact your emergency manager, contact your extension office. And let me note too, Megan, that always brings up, in the middle of a disaster, don't self-deploy. So if you know that there's a fire on the other side of the county, don't go grabbing your truck and trailer and running to your neighbors unless you've been specifically asked by emergency management to do so. If you're the person coming in with your 24-foot stock trailer and your truck while everyone else is trying to come down that one-lane road, again, we've layered a disaster on top of a disaster. So don't self-deploy, but do get involved in your county rescue team or emergency management planning and get hooked up with the right folks to know that you are being helpful and not a hindrance.
Yes, very important stuff to think about. Thank you. All right, well, Thanks, Todd. Important topics, but yes, very terrifying. So, excellent.
Hope I
Yeah,
scared you into action there, Catherine.
lots of information there to chew on. So with that, I'll pass it on to Sydney and we'll get started on our last presenter here to end the series.
Thank you, Todd, for that, and thank you, Megan. Our last presenter for today is Dr. Jennifer Martin. Dr. Jennifer Martin is an associate professor in meat safety and quality and meat extension specialist in the Department of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University. In 2022, Jennifer was named a Presidential Leadership Fellow and currently spends part of her time assisting in university-wide strategic initiatives. She is originally from Central Texas and received her MS in 2010 and Ph.D. in 2014 from Texas Tech University before joining Colorado State University in the spring of 2015. Jennifer's research program focuses on the quality and safety of meat and related products, emphasizing exploration of solutions and opportunities with industry partners. In addition to research, Jennifer works closely with meat and livestock industry members across Colorado and the nation. Notably, she is the coordinator of the Pet Food Alliance, a collaborative industry organization focused on exploring solutions for the pet food and rendering industries. She also serves as a co-leader for the Upskilling Initiative, a workforce development program. She plays an active role in on-campus programs, including the Provost Council for Engagement, Faculty Council, and numerous committees. In addition to her university work, Jennifer is involved in numerous livestock organizations across the country. Jennifer, her husband Chad, and their dog Mel live in Timoth, Colorado. So with that being said, I will have Jennifer share her screen and take herself off mute. She will be presenting on influences on meat quality. Whenever you're ready, Jennifer.
It looks like I can't share my screen. It
Okay.
worked earlier.
Retta, can you help us give?
I
Oh,
just,
there we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me actually share a different screen so you're looking at not all of your cells, but you're getting to look at the presentation. Well, thanks everyone for the opportunity to join today. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I'll try to keep within the time limit to save time for questions, certainly. But without being able to see you all, hopefully you have some questions and that we can have an engaging discussion at the end of this presentation. I'm going to start us off right at the lunch hour with a question about food, which shouldn't come as a surprise since we're talking about meat. But I want you to think for a second about what a high quality meat eating experience looks like to you. So for me, I'm hungry and I'm a Texan, so the picture on the top right-hand screen rings quality to me. I love brisket. But many of us know exactly what we're looking for when we think of a truly high quality meat eating experience. We have certain desires that we wish to obtain when we eat meat, and that varies consumer to consumer, but most usually it's good flavor, good texture or tenderness, and then a juicy eating experience. And so the question we always get asked, that's our target. We know that as livestock producers, and as meat processors, we're trying to deliver products that 100% of the time meet that expectation for whomever is consuming the food that's being produced. So the question that I always get asked, or that I always ask of others, is if we know the target, why haven't we figured out an easier way to get there? If we know what consumers desire, if we know what meat quality means, why don't we do it 100% of the time? Or perhaps why can't we deliver or guarantee excellent meat eating experiences 100% of the time? And so I think one of the things that's really crucial in this conversation is the recognition that producing high quality meat is an art form that has underpinnings in science. And in order for us to understand how to deliver on the quality expectations that consumers have, it's really helpful to understand a bit about the science of how muscle, fat, and bones developed, and how each of those variables may influence not only the carcass performance, but the eating quality and the ultimate experience that a consumer has. So I have the utmost respect for livestock producers and meat processors, because truly there is a balance between the art that goes into what you all do, as well as the science that underpins the reality that we see. So I like to say that building high quality meat starts at the cellular level and then ends at the product that's on the rail. And you may wonder, when we say it starts at the cell, what does that actually mean? And in true form, meat quality is a cellular process that actually starts with the cells that are responsible for muscle, and we call those myocytes, so myo meaning muscle. And then we have cells that are responsible for fat development. So we have stem cells that turn into those things on the bottom that are called adipocytes. And those are the things we all wish we had fewer of, but from a meat quality perspective, they're incredibly important and play a really big role. And then lastly, we have the cells on the right-hand side that form bone or form the skeletal system itself. And so when we think about all of the components that influence the eating experience, and specifically the quality of that eating experience, it's not only the development of the muscles, but it's the intersection of muscle development, fat development, and then recognizing that we're talking about skeleton or skeletal muscle. The bones play a really important piece of that process. So I'm going to start first with the skeleton, because I think it's one of the things that we often overlook, the important role the skeleton plays in developing high quality meat and developing muscles that produce high quality meat. So high quality meat animals begin with good skeletal structure. So I like to think of this similarly to the foundation of a house. We can't build good muscles if we don't have a good foundation to build them on. So muscles or bones serve as levers for the muscles. So they're not only responsible for giving the muscle something to move, but they also serve as the levers for muscles to grow into and to support. We also know that these skeletal structures are bones formed prenatally or before the animal is born. And at the time of birth, the ratio of bone to muscle is really high. And that's the same for animals as it is to humans. We have a lot of bones when we're born and not much muscle tissue. And as we age, that ratio begins to change. And it changes as a reflection not only of aging and maturity, but also nutrition and how the muscles and the bones are used. Hormones, and then various management strategies. So we see lots of variation in skeletal size and skeletal strength based on all of these things. So it's not just a factor of age, but all of the management principles can also impact the development of the skeleton. We also know that after birth, bone growth tends to occur with bones lengthening. That's the same for humans, right? All of us at some point in time got taller. Maybe some are taller than others. Maybe some stopped growing earlier than others, or maybe some of you are still growing yet today. So after we're born, we see most of the bone growth be longitudinal and not necessarily in width. So a lot of the time I get a question about, well, okay, if we're talking about muscles and we're talking about meat and meat quality, why do we care about bones? We don't eat bones. But again, it's really important to recognize that the skeleton creates the foundation for muscle development, and specifically skeletal muscle development that we turn into meat. And so as those bones are growing, muscles are also growing. So not only can skeletal development impact yield, it also plays a really important role in quality. And one of the easiest ways to see that is if we have large frame-sized animals, so big skeletons, big bones, they often have a faster rate of growth. So they're not only growing faster because their bones are growing faster, the muscles have to grow to catch up, but they also generally have a leaner meat. So usually less fat in that meat than we might see in animals that are slower growing. And I like to equate this to, I have a younger brother who, when he was growing up, he's pretty tall, he's about 6'6", and we could not give him enough food to put weight on him. He was growing so fast that there simply wasn't enough calories in his diet to allow him to get anything bigger than a toothpick. He was always a skinny, tall boy. And that's something that I like to relate this to. If you're growing so fast, or if your skeletal structure is so large, it's hard to get animals enough calories or enough energy to develop some of the things that we associate with high quality eating experiences. So these larger framed animals tend to produce leaner meat. They tend to be later maturing because it does take longer for them to develop and to accumulate the amount of fat that's needed that we associate with quality. So let's talk for a bit about muscles. This is the part where, as a meat scientist and as a person who's fascinated and studies muscles for my research focus, I spend a lot of time understanding not only what happens to the muscle after the animal is born and how or after the animal's harvested and how those things impact quality, but it's really important for us to take a step back and recognize that muscle development doesn't start when an animal is harvested. It starts well before the animal is even born. And so much so that the majority of muscle development begins really early in gestation. And during the last months of pregnancy, the number of muscle cells that an animal or a human has is largely set. And so what that means is that after birth, for humans and in animals, we don't generally accumulate more muscle cells. Unfortunately, there isn't a muscle pill that we can all take to accumulate more muscle cells. All that happens after birth is the muscle cells that we were born with get bigger in size. And so we can see them get bigger in size and get smaller in size, but generally we cannot accumulate more gross muscles. All that we can do is change the size and shape of those muscles. So what does this mean from an animal perspective or a livestock perspective? That tells us that prenatal factors influence skeletal muscle development. So what happens while the animal is in utero, while the mom is pregnant with that animal, is going to impact the development of muscle cells. So management of pregnant females, particularly in that mid-gestation phase, is strongly associated with muscling. And if there's something wrong with the mama cow, for example, during gestation, if she has poor nutrition or an illness, you'll see that in her offspring, and that the offspring generally are lighter muscled. They're going to have a lower yielding carcass. And so you may question, well, what does that have to do with quality of meat, right? If we're talking about muscle, so what that the carcasses of her calves are lower yielding, or so what that it's a lighter muscled carcass? And it actually has quite a bit to do with the quality of the meat, because not only does it impact the amount of muscle cells, but we also see impacts on the type of muscles. So we know that not all muscles are created equally. And when an animal is born, the majority of muscle development is associated with the muscles that are critical and essential for survival. So usually we see at birth muscles that are associated with the internal organs and muscles that are associated with the skeleton to facilitate movement. Those are the things that most of the energy is dedicated towards. And then after birth, most of the changes that occur, or as the animal begins to mature, most of the changes that occur are with muscles not associated with the skeleton. So those muscles that are not necessarily needed for movement, but are needed for support of the animal. And we see lots of changes associated with how those muscles are used, where they're located on a carcass, as well as the nutrition of the animal. We know too that not all muscles are created equal, so we have different types of muscle fibers. Certain muscle fiber types are associated with different muscles. So muscles that are really tender have different muscle fibers than muscles that tend to be more tough. Muscles that are a bright cherry red color and stay that way longer have different muscle fibers than those that turn brown faster or have a lighter or paler color. Muscles that are really juicy have a different muscle fiber type than muscles that tend to produce meat that is dry. And all of these are directed not only in how the animal is, or how the muscles are used in the nutrition of the animal, but what happened during the developmental stages that occurred prenatally or when the mom was pregnant. So when we think about all that's happening, right? So we're thinking well before we have a carcass on a rail and then meat on a plate, all of these things are impacting the muscle development and the principles of the quality of the meat, as well as the framework the muscles need to develop, so the skeleton and the muscle themselves. The one that we see most emphasis placed on is fat. And the reason why we place a lot of emphasis on fat is because fat is highly correlated with flavor. And most consumers in the US tell us that yes, meat tenderness is important. Yes, meat juiciness is important. But by far, the thing that is most important to consumers is flavor. And all that has to happen for a consumer to be satisfied is the tenderness has to be acceptable. It doesn't have to be the most tender steak you've ever eaten. It has to be something that's at least acceptable enough for you to consume. And then your eating satisfaction usually reflects the flavor of the product. And if it's tough, but really good flavored, we tend to be, okay, well, it tasted really good, even if it were a little tough. If it's tough, but really poor flavor, that's a no-go situation. That's a really bad eating experience. But if we have meat products that are tough and are tender and then not good flavored, we see the majority of consumers who will say that's a poor eating experience, which tells us that flavor is more important today than tenderness or toughness. It just has to be acceptable, and then flavor. And again, the primary driver of flavor is fat. And so we've spent a lot of time as a research community over the past 20 or 30 years, not only understanding the role that fat plays in the eating experience, but recognizing again that these are live animals and understanding how fat develops. And so let's take a step back away from the carcass and focus on what's happening with the live animal and the timeline in which fat develops. So lipid cells, so the fat cells, develop late in gestation and early in the postnatal period. So we're talking about at the end of pregnancy and right after birth. We also know that fat develops at different rates. And it makes sense when you think about fat types developing at different rates, when you think about the role that fat plays in the living animal. So the first type of fat to develop is the fat that protects and surrounds the internal organs, which makes sense when you think about the physiology of the animal. Its primary purpose is to survive, and it's going to produce fat and develop fat that aids in its survival. The second type of fat that develops is really a type of fat that doesn't do a whole lot from a meat quality perspective. It's a type of fat on the outside of the skin, which we call subcutaneous fat. So it's the fat in a meat science perspective that we trim off, that consumers tell us they don't want to see when they go to the grocery store and buy a steak. The next two types of fat that develop are either in between the muscles themselves, or the one that we focus on largely is marbling or intramuscular fat, which sits in between those muscle fibers. Muscles develop marbling at different rates, so not all muscles have the same ability to develop marbling. That's a reflection of the fiber type. So if we see the muscle fiber being impacted by nutrition of the mama cow during pregnancy, that may change the ability of that muscle to actually develop marbling once the animal is born. The other thing that I think is important to think about, if we look at this timeline of when fat deposits develop, so early in the gestational period, we see the development, so the growth in numbers, so hyperplasia means growth in numbers of fat cells. And these fat cells that develop earlier in pregnancy are generally associated with the types of fat that don't add value to the carcass and don't impact meat quality. So the fat that surrounds the internal organs and the fat that's on the outside of the carcass. And immediately prior to birth, and then through the weaning interval, do we see the development of the types of fat that do impact meat quality, and specifically the types of fat that are associated with marbling. So this is a result of a tremendous amount of research that has examined if marbling is our focus. If we know that if we increase marbling, we're going to increase the consumer's satisfaction with a meat eating experience. We need to know when marbling starts, and recognizing that it doesn't start once we have a carcass. It actually starts well before the animal is born through that early weaning period. And so understanding what happens during these times, recognizing that if we have a calf that is sick early in the prenatal or postnatal period, that will impact the development of marbling cells. And one thing that I like to tell producers and those that I interact with, it doesn't matter what happens once we're at the finishing period. If all of these things that happened prior to birth or soon after birth, if something happened there, we'll see the impacts on meat quality later. So oftentimes we'll see producers who will say, we have cattle that just aren't grading. We're doing everything right, we're finishing, and we're giving them all the feed they need at the end of the finishing period, but we can't move the needle from select to choice, or we can't move the needle from choice to prime. Why is that? And certain times it's genetics, but in many cases it's something that happened prenatally in reflection of management of the pregnant cow, or in other cases it's something that happened post-birth, and immediately post-birth as we see those marbling cells begin to develop. So all of the things that we focus on, we think about a carcass that's high yielding and high quality. Yes, what we do at the finishing period is important, but all of those building blocks started well before the calf ever reached the finishing phase. That same interval applies to both pigs, goats, lambs, and chickens. The timelines are a bit different. And so I like to throw this slide up when I'm talking about this presentation, or when I'm talking about this topic, because I think one of the things we often forget is just how complicated it is and how difficult it is to consistently produce high yielding, high quality carcasses. And we're talking about living beings that have a physiological process that is happening to support themselves, not to produce meat. And so trying to balance the science of animal development and muscle growth and fat deposition and skeletal growth, with the end goal that we talked about at the beginning of producing a product that is consistently desirable to the consumers who will purchase it. It's a difficult job to do. And those who do it, I have a tremendous amount of respect, because it truly is an art form that is underpinned by science. So just to wrap us up as we kind of build towards the end, we have all of the things have worked. We have a foundation that's built. We have good skeletal structure. We have muscles that are beginning to grow. We have fat cells that have been developed. What happens after birth? Where do we see the finish line, and how do we get there? And that's where balancing what happens after birth becomes really important. As an animal matures, we again see that ratio of muscle to bone increase, where we accumulate more or bigger muscles. Unfortunately for humans, we do that early on, and then we're starting to see muscle growth decline the older we get. But in livestock producing, meat producing species, generally until they're harvested, that ratio of muscle to bone increases until it plateaus near the end of their lifetime. We also see fat overcome muscle, where the ratio of fat deposition exceeds the ratio of muscle growth. That same thing happens in humans as well. We also know that fat deposition is really energy inefficient. It takes a lot of excess calories to deposit fat. And then when you think about the ways in which fat develops and the order in which fat develops, in order for marbling or intramuscular fat to develop, it takes even more calories, an excess of calories, because an animal's first job is to protect itself. So it's going to deposit fat internally. It's going to deposit fat on the outside, deposit fat to protect its muscles, and only then will it deposit marbling. So it has to have a lot of excess calories to get there. So it's a really energy inefficient process that occurs. And the only way we get cattle or pigs or chickens or lamb or sheep or lamb or goats that are finishing with high marbling is when we have an excess of nutrition or an excess of calories to get them there. So we know that a lot of different things can impact meat quality. So things such as nutrition and composition of the diet, stress, hormones, supplements, the environment. Here in Fort Collins, it's been really nice the past couple of days. It was snowy and rainy this morning. That environmental stress can have an impact depending on where an animal is in their lifetime or that cycle of muscle, bone, and fat development. The one I want to point out and call out very specifically is the role of nutrition of the animal in meat quality. So what does it matter what we feed them? How does that impact the quality of the meat, and specifically the flavor of the meat that come from those animals? And I like to just focus on the composition. And I like to use, and when I'm talking with my students particularly, I use the example of ourselves because we operate in a very similar fashion. And I want you to think for a second. If you were to start today and consume Twinkies every day, and only Twinkies for the next year, would you look different a year from today than if you were today to consume for the next year a balanced diet of lean meats and vegetables and grains and all of the things that we're encouraged to eat? Would you look different? I hope you're nodding your head, because we would all look different if we consumed a diet only of Twinkies compared to a balanced diet. So when we eat different things, we're influencing our composition. And that's no different for livestock species as well. So if we think about this from a beef cattle perspective, this is how it influences composition. Not only does it influence the gross composition, so in the case of Twinkies versus a lean meat-based and vegetable-based diet, we're going to see differences in the total amount of fat compared to the total amount of muscle. It's also going to impact the composition of the fat itself. And that fat is associated with flavor. So if we require a lot of calories to get us to depositing intramuscular fat, it takes a lot of those calories from different feedstuffs to allow us to deposit intramuscular fat. We know in the cattle industry, at least, that historically grain-based feedstuffs give us that excess energy, the high energy needed to deposit that fat. And that excess energy used in a grain-based diet is very well documented in being a great opportunity for an animal to deposit fat. We also know that excess energy, those excess calories, can also come from forage-based diets, but the composition of the forage itself will impact the composition of the fat. So if we think about composition impacting meat quality, it's not just composition as it relates to the total amount of muscle, to the total amount of fat, it's the composition of the fat that's going to impact the eating experience. And so it's important for us to recognize that not all alternatives, not all feedstuffs, not all forages are created equal. And so when we experience different eating qualities, given that the food, the calories are different, it makes sense because compositionally, those are different. So as we evaluate different types of feedstuffs, I like to remind people to think about these scientific principles. Not only does it meet the maintenance needs of the animal, remember it's a living being, they have to give themselves enough energy to fuel their body as well as protect their internal organs. Does it give them enough calories? Does it give them the excess energy that is biologically needed to deposit intramuscular fat? If they're deficient in energy, it doesn't matter how much or how high quality the feedstuff is, they can't deposit intramuscular fat because biologically it requires an excess, and it's a very energy inefficient process. And then in what cases might you use supplements to address those deficiencies? Are there things that can happen to help alleviate some of that requirement for excess energy that may not be obtained just strictly through the forage that an animal is getting? So just to wrap us up and hopefully save some time for questions, I think it's really important, and the reason I enjoy giving this conversation, I had to cut a lot out of it to squeeze it into 20 minutes, but I think having this conversation is important for us to recognize that we're starting with a living animal that in principle is it's not built to produce meat. And so we're trying to navigate the physiological and biological processes of the animal, knowing the impacts those have on the production of meat and specifically the quality of meat. Because our end goal from a meat producing perspective is to produce products that consumers find desirable, where every time they go to the grocery store or a steakhouse, they leave it satisfied and are willing to come back again. And it seems as if that's easy to do. And we often say, well, the challenge is not the industry, the challenge is not what we're doing, it's the consumers. But the reality is it's difficult, and it is an art form. It is a science behind it, and balancing both of those and turning live animals into high quality meat, understanding that the live animal that is being produced for that high quality meat, the things that are impacting meat quality started before they were even born. That's an art form that many of our producers and processors have perfected and do so well. And I think it's something that's important for us to acknowledge the role that science and art play in doing this job to produce and feed Americans and citizens around the globe. So to wrap us up, building high quality meat starts at the cellular level and ends at the rail. And it's important for us to understand the science, to have a basic understanding of what's going on from a physiological and biological perspective, and respecting the art form. And then as producers, working to perfect that balance of understanding the biology, understanding the art form that exists when you're out in the field doing this, and finding the balance between them so that we can consistently deliver high quality eating experiences for consumers. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hope we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very informative. I always find that information fascinating. We have one question so far. Could you touch on different breeds, use of forage in meat quality production?
Yeah, so I'll focus specifically on cat. And I notice, is my mic working still?
It is. It's a little scratchy, but it's not bad.
Okay, sorry, I have my headphones in, so I was hopeful that would help. But
Oh.
So I'm going to answer that question from the perspective of cattle versus other species. Different animals are known to utilize forages better than others, right? So there are certain animals, and specifically composition breeds of animals, that we know do really, really well in a grain-based scenario. And generally, we see that a reflection of not only the research that's gone into letting us know that, but how these animals have been bred to perform in those specific environments. I think in the space of breeds that perform best in a forage-based diet, it really is a reflection of the forage more than a reflection of the animal itself. And so when I think about where I grew up in South Texas, or in central to South Texas, the type of animal that is raised there on forage looks very different than the type of animal that we see in Colorado, which is more a reflection of the forages in that part of the country, as well as the environmental conditions in that part of the country versus the animal itself. So it's matching the forage with the right animal versus saying this particular breed does well across the board. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. I know I have a question, and it might be kind of a loaded question, but
Yeah.
if there's one thing that producers can do, sometimes we're kind of left to the elements of what, how much moisture we have. Last year we had a pretty harsh winter in Western Colorado. If you could just say one thing that you would recommend producers do without a doubt to help with their meat quality, what would that be?
I think it is a loaded question, but I think the way I would answer it is to have realistic expectations of knowing that if it is a really hard weaning season, if it was a hard calving season, or if you had things that happen during when you have pregnant cows, to understand the impacts that will happen and recognize, if you think about the timeline of what's happening in relationship to the lifetime of the animal, that if you let's say, for example, that there were some challenges during weaning, then the impacts that you will see most immediately from a quality perspective will happen at the end of the finishing period, and you're not going to be able to fix them largely because the things that were needed for that animal to grade or to reach the desired quality just didn't happen when it was born. And so one of the things that I often visit with producers about is just understanding the physiology and the timeline of development, and then setting realistic expectations, because I see lots of frustration happen often when there are things that happen when you have sick animals or the weather is bad, and you're going to the immediate impacts are there, and anything that happens later on is a reflection of that. And so if you wait and try to fix the problem at the end, it doesn't really work, because the things that they need to develop at the end weren't there. So I just try to caution producers to have realistic expectations, and if they need an intervention, to know when the right time for an intervention is. And often it's not at the very end, it's sometime before.
Thank you. We've got another one. It looks like maybe more of a statement than a question, but there's always a balance of getting cows overweight as they end the last trimester. Sorry. Body condition is important. How fat or slim should we get them in pregnancy? Sorry, so that is a question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's a balance, because certainly we do see that relationship between overall fatness and body condition score of the cow, and calving ease, and some of the other challenges that cows may have if they get overly fat. I think more important than fatness is making sure that their basic nutritional needs are met. So you can have cows that are super fat, but they're not getting basic nutrients that calf needs to develop muscles or fat cells. And so I think it's having a balanced diet more so than having a diet that's focused on fat. And that's usually where we see the changes that you'll notice later on when they're not grading, or you can't get those calves to grow fast. It's not because the cow was fat or she was too thin, it's that she didn't have the basic nutritional needs that she needed to produce. And so you can have cows that are super fat, but they didn't have the nutrition, the balanced nutrition they needed, or those required nutrients necessary for growth of that calf, and you'll still see the same impacts later on. Great question, though. It certainly is a balance.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Go ahead and drop them in the chat here. We've got a couple minutes yet. Please remember, everyone, to take our evaluation. You should get an email with the evaluation link as well. Retta dropped the link in the chat there. Please just take a couple minutes, give us some feedback so we know how to better conduct these webinars for the future. And just a reminder that we will have the recordings and the presentations posted to our ABM website. Retta, maybe if you could drop that link in the chat, that would be helpful. Aside from breed, when those cows get large, any relation to large calves at birth?
That's another loaded question. So certainly there are some correlation between birth weight and performance. I would say it's more a reflection of genetics and breed than it is nutrition in that particular case, right? So one of the things we focus specifically on the cellular development and the physiology, but all of that's impacted by genetics, right? So if an animal has a genetic ability or propensity, as we call it, to grow, then these nutritional and developmental things have to happen for it to reach that ability. And if they don't, it's never going to reach that ability, right? It's just like in the case of a human. If I have parents who are 6'6", and I have the genetic ability to be that same height, but if I only eat Cheetos as a toddler, I'm probably not going to get there. And so think of it in that situation, that it's a balance of the genetic potential the animal has, and then understanding with that in place, what are their needs and how are those needs met? And so if the genetic potential is there, but the needs aren't met, then you're not going to reach the genetic potential. If the needs are met, but the genetic potential isn't there, then it doesn't matter. The potential was never there to begin with. And so that's where you see certain breeds that are known to be larger framed or faster muscle growth or leaner meat tissue. Those breed characteristics still play a role here, but they're just giving an animal the ability to. All of these other things have to happen after that.
Thank you. All right. Well, it looks like that's all that we have for questions. If anybody has any last minute ones, pop them in here. Again, the evaluation link is in the chat there. If you just take a moment to conduct that for us as well, we'll be sending out via email, we'll be sending out recordings and the evaluation link. And everything can be found on our ABM website as well. So